Welcome everyone. It is 3 p.m. and it's time for the server room show. This is episode 24. Thank you for SDF Public Unix System for hosting the server. As you already know, this is part 2 of George, the interview I did with George Neville Neil, talking about BSD and many other things. As the whole interview was around 45 minutes, I made it as a two-part episode. So in the previous episode 23, you have had a chance to listen to my introduction, and after part 1 of this interview, and now it's time for part 2, which is the last part of the interview, and after I will close it with some comments and kind of like an epilogue. I hope that you enjoyed part 1 and you had a chance to watch it as a video on the Server Room Show video channel. It's in the show notes, which finally I managed to publish, as Anon Radio's WordPress server was under update and maintenance. I was not able to publish the show notes before, but now you can go and grab the link for the video recording of the previous episode, and you can grab the one for this one as well. Once both episode airs, as I mentioned, I will release the whole 45-minute video interview as a one piece on the same link on the video channel for the Server Room Show website. I hope you enjoy it, and I let you listen to part 2 of the interview with George Neville Neil from FreeBSD. Mentioning hardware, you do have some curious hardware around what you kept, or?
Here, I'll show you my latest thing. So this
Something little.
is a Z80 based kit from this guy in the UK who does a website called RC 2014. So I still maintain my interest in CPM and in Z80, in part because when I was young and CPM was a thing, I was too poor to afford that hardware. The CPM stuff was more expensive. But for microcomputers, it was the closest thing before the Amiga to having an OS. The Apple stuff was cool, but it was a monitor. C64 was a monitor. Whereas CPM really tried to be a bit more of an operating system, mostly around how disks worked. So I've occasionally been just building up these, I spend a couple hours just building them together and then hacking a bit on them just to see what they're like. So yeah, I tend to have random bits of hardware around the house. I mean, that's probably the most recent one that I've put together. I've got lots of Raspberry Pis and BeagleBone Blacks. So for the last few years, we've been teaching graduate students, operating system performance work, a course that Robert Watson developed at the University of Cambridge. That's all taught on the BeagleBone Black. So I have those around the house. I have RPi 3 and RPi 4, various other bits of hardware that are proprietary to my clients, which I will not show on a video. But yeah, I have lots of random bits of hardware. The other nice thing about embedded systems is, as someone who likes to live in cities in which we have small apartments, it's a lot easier than having a 19-inch rack in my apartment full of servers.
Yeah, I am the other type of guy sitting next to a 42U rack, but at least it says compact, so it's worth the money. Embedded things are very, very interesting indeed. I see then you more of this tinkering board or developer board kind of person. It's good for saving space in a small apartment indeed. I probably should go and switch to that route, but definitely that needs more knowledge on the low level things. Definitely. Embedded computing, as you work on FreeBSD, if you have to compare, even though I'm sure it's not a fair comparison, what VxWorks can do on embedded systems and what you can achieve if you use FreeBSD or perhaps another BSD for the same. It's just not possible.
So, I mean, the real thing is that one is growing up from the bottom and one is coming down from the top. So, I mean, Unix-like systems were really developed on mini computers, which at this point, mini computers are about as powerful as really cheap embedded. But over time, the amount of code and technology we've added to the Unix-like systems is huge, right? So, you know, squeezing a FreeBSD or a NetBSD or anything like that down into 256 kbytes, right? If you talk about something that's really embedded, it's just not that possible. Whereas the embedded systems, and there are many of them, it's kind of amazing to me. I've looked at a lot of various embedded systems, not just VxWorks, and they're all the same. I mean, QNX was one different one. There's a couple, Cell 4, but almost all of the rest of them, VxWorks, PSOS, Minute, FreeRTOS, Embed from ARM, they are all the same. They're all a memory allocator and a scheduler and task creation, and they're very small, and they generally don't have memory protection. It's the virtual memory system, which is what makes applications programming possible in almost any modern big system. Those things don't exist in an embedded system. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. If you want to be able to run the vast suite of POSIX-like software that's been developed for Linux, Unix, whatever, that stuff just doesn't run on those embedded systems because they may have a POSIX library, but they don't do enough of what POSIX does. Whereas then the problem of POSIX-like systems is now they're huge, right? This massive amount of software. So fitting that into, a 1 meg RAM machine with a few megs of flash, and then putting it on a light pole, which is what we usually do with embedded systems, just put it out somewhere as an application, doesn't really work. I mean, the closest we come to having embedded systems or Unix-like systems in the small are phones. So you have Android, which is a Linux kernel, although it becomes less Linux every day. You have iOS, which is a BSD kernel and a whole bunch of modifications. But your phone has megabytes and megabytes of RAM and gigabytes and gigabytes of flash. And so is that an embedded system? Not so much. I mean, the closest thing is probably an Apple Watch or an Android watch, because again, it's still going to have the kernel. But that's why a watch has multiple megabytes of RAM. I mean, who on earth thinks that their watch needs megabytes of RAM? I mean, I'm wearing one.
Yeah, so
but it's it's the truly deeply embedded systems and the Unix-like systems. I mean, it is always interesting to try and drive FreeBSD in that direction, just because it's nice to have certain features that we have in the bigger operating systems. It remains an open question whether it's easier to grow on top of a smaller kernel or cut down a bigger piece of software. But I mean, that's what you're doing. You're doing this. How close can we get?
Yeah. So unless something is built from the ground up to be used in an embedded scenario, it is very hard to compete against those offerings.
Again, it depends. So one of the things that's quite interesting is it's no longer compute power that matters generally, right? Your embedded edge device doesn't really need much more instructions per second. What matters is battery. So once you get to the point of having a battery-powered device as opposed to a wall-powered device, then suddenly a lot of the features that you have in bigger systems, in particular things like virtual memory, which put a high demand on various bits of hardware, those become more difficult, right? So once you get to the point of, I have a battery in a small device, and that battery needs to run for days. I mean, think about the earliest cell phones, the earliest smartphones, the early Apple phone and the early Google phones. Those batteries barely lasted. I mean, you would have to recharge during the day, and that was really not very acceptable. So a lot of work has been done to make that a lot better. But it's still the case that if you especially want to have an unattended embedded device, think about a vending machine. Now vending machines are plugged into the wall, but think about something that has to run on battery for a long time, something that someone carries, a Fitbit, some small medical device. The features that we have in fully featured Unix-like operating systems, in particular virtual memory, but a lot of the other features there, they eat the battery. So it's no longer, oh, the processor is not fast enough. The processor is plenty fast. But if you keep using that processor at full speed, the battery will last an hour and then the device will be useless.
I see. You mentioned that you went towards FreeBSD because it was running much more stable on your Intel laptop back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you got into it. You also co-authored many books, more than one. We call it many. Also with Kirk, you mentioned Kirk McCusick. So how was it working with him on a technical paper? You knew you mentioned that you got to know him by connections, but you knew about him before you actually met him. You know what I mean? So you knew about his background and the things he did or known for before you eventually get to meet him.
So when I was in university, the 4.3 book came out, and my university course did not use that book. But the 4.3 BSD book came out, and there were two books books are expensive when you're in college. So there were two books that I bought for myself that I read on my own without any course. And one was the 4.3 BSD book, the original black book with the daemon. And the other was Doug Comer's internetworking book, which was how I learned about networking. And so I knew who all of those McCusick and all those folks were from reading the 4.3 book on my own. But it was an OS book, so I read it like a novel. It was very interesting to me. And then when I met Kirk while I was working at the University of California at Berkeley, we became friends. We remained friends. And when the 4.4 book came out, I was one of the reviewers. So I actually reviewed the book, went through the whole book and made comments and said, oh, I don't understand this, or can you explain more, that kind of thing. And then when he went to do the first full FreeBSD book, which was different than the 4.4 BSD book, he didn't have anyone to work on the networking chapters. And networking is something I really enjoy and sort of the main area of my interest and expertise in operating systems. And Kirk and I have a very good working relationship because I don't understand file systems and he doesn't understand networking, and we're both very open about that. He does understand it and I understand it a little bit, but we're both, it's like, that's your problem. The file system is his problem and the networking is my problem. So when he went to do the first FreeBSD book, I said, look, if you need someone to work on the networking chapters, I can do that. I'd be very interested in doing that. So he took me up on the offer, and then we worked on the book, and that was the 2004 edition. And then for the 2014 edition, we brought on Robert Watson to do the security chapter. Robert's quite the expert on system security and has worked on FreeBSD for a long time. And that was the 2014 book. So I think I've got 4 more years until we get to get the next book out. So we haven't started yet.
Mm-hmm. But there is a new book coming.
Well, we'll see if I can con Kirk into doing another one. I think he'll do it. We usually takes us a couple of years, so we wouldn't even start till 2022.
He should.
Yeah.
If you talk to him, tell him that he should. I plan on talking to him. Actually, before your interview, I was pursuing him into pretty much something similar, and he confirmed, and then I sent him the same way, sent him the draft of the questions, and that was the last I heard about him. I hope that he's okay. And
I got an email from him last week. I think he's fine.
Yeah. Perhaps he didn't like the questions.
No. I think it's more that everybody's gotten a little busy.
Yeah.
At least for those of us who are working from home.
Yeah. So FreeBSD, even though your interest is in networking, myself, I enjoy networking. I like it. I have switches and whatnot, and I'm able to ruin my network at home that it does very strange errors, and I don't know why, but they are interesting for whatnot. Still, you are on the lead on the kernel team in FreeBSD, apart from being a director of the FreeBSD Foundation. Is it networking?
So the project doesn't really have leads. I am a source committer, but there are 300 source committers. I'm not the only one. The areas I tend to work on are networking. Although over the last few years, I did a bit of work on the dtrace port. I have many interests. One of my interests is in debugging and distributed debugging. And so I worked on a research project with some folks called Cadets. And that project looked at doing using dtrace as a way of doing distributed tracing and distributed debugging, and in particular looking for security issues as distributed systems are attacked. So I've worked on dtrace recently. I tend to spend most of my time in the networking stack. But say to compare against Linux, we don't have a lieutenant, so it's not like I'm the lead and I have to approve things. Various people will chime in on various commits. It's a fairly open system. You know, if you break the build, we make you back out your change. Yeah, it's networking is the area where I have the most knowledge. That's for sure. I'm not an expert on the VM system. I'm not an expert on the file system, but you know, I can look at them if I have to. But networking is where my expertise is, in particular in the protocol stacks and device drivers. I've done a lot of network device drivers.
Then you full IPv6 compliant, your own home, perhaps?
So in the US, we're not getting IPv6 to the home. So there's not, I mean, we run IPv6 because almost anything that does discovery now does that. So like all the Apple equipment here or things like that run v6. But there's no v6 addresses allocated by my upstream provider. So my only option would be a tunnel.
Yeah, I do the same with the Hurricane tunnel. Yeah.
Yeah.
However, in Spain, I discovered before we planned this whole thing. Now in Barcelona, for example, they have some kind of open source, open-hearted providers. At least one who do run IPv6 allocations to the house. It's not
nice.
It's not the fiber to the home. It's they call it fiber to the building, and actually they also run their infrastructure on FreeBSD as far as I heard. I didn't have much time to go more beyond it, as they are in Barcelona. The most of the documentation I found was in Catalan, so I pretty much that's how far I got, and I managed to look at some of their drawings and diagrams, and the one guy from the FreeBSD mailing list who actually uses it, he told me that yeah those guys are running BSD and they are completely trying to be like this open network. It's very, very interesting, and they do the same 600 megabit synchronous, and actually it's cheaper than how much we pay for big providers here in Madrid. So I'm pretty much envy at the moment, but I have to stay. But anyhow, that's not interesting for you. Your website, it mentions that you work with your own consulting company. Is it evolved around embedded systems, or you share your expertise and knowledge around those other topics like networking or IT, if you give?
So most of my work is based on the work that I'm interested in. So lots of networking work, lots of security work. So I have a background in security, and I spent quite a while doing various security related pieces of work. I mean, I find that, especially from the software side, people with a lot of experience in systems software, not just operating systems, but systems software, uh, and especially distributed systems, have a reasonable enough background to do security work. So networking, security, operating systems development. Um, One of the things I got involved with for quite a while was very accurate time systems. So I worked to resurrect the precision time protocol daemon, which is used in factories and on trading floors and financial trading to do very high fidelity distributed time, much more high fidelity than we can get with NTP, mostly because of the distance used and the things we can do, advantages we can take because we're directly on the LAN. So I've done bits of consulting in all of those areas. Um, yeah, and often that leads me into embedded systems. More recently, of course, people who are doing IoT-like systems. I mean, IoT is just advertising on top of embedded systems with, you know, an AWS backend. So I've wound up consulting a bit on IoT systems as well.
Interesting. For me, as an outsider to embedded systems, IoT does seem or look like embedded systems, sensors or
Very much.
pretty much quite clever boards which can do many things you don't even dream of. Anything else you would like to share or
I mean, I don't, not really.
not really? Okay.
I think the questions you brought up pretty much got to what we were going to talk about.
Yeah, I think we managed to cover everything. Thank you very much for your time, and I wish you all the best.
Thanks. You too. And it was good talking to you.
Thanks. And that was the end of part 2, the end of the last part of the interview I did with George Neville from FreeBSD. You can watch now the whole interview on the video channel of the Server Room Show website. The link is on the show notes, as I mentioned in the beginning. You can find all the previous show recordings, video recordings, in case if you wanna have a look. This was episode 24, the second part. If you missed part 1, then please have a look at episode 23 and start from there. So, as you probably figured it out from the interview if you have listened, George is a very well-versed individual who has a lifelong passion for computers and operating systems, amongst including BSD and FreeBSD. He is also the co-author of the book, The Design and Implementation of the FreeBSD Operating System, second edition, with Kirk McCusick. He has a long list of publications and presentations teaching history. You can consult on his website all the presentations and teaching he did so far. And actually, amongst all the odds which I had and what I thought, he's really a great person and a lot of fun to talk to. You probably saw on his website from where I extracted this information that he really dedicated and has extensive set of work on open source. The most and the most prominent is FreeBSD, where he's actively taking part of and also being a director on the FreeBSD Foundation. He also did many tools or pieces which are released open source, like the PTPD, which is a precision time protocol daemon under BSD licensed implementation of the IEEE 1588 protocols. It is used to closely synchronize LAN connected hosts. the PCS, the packet construction set, an easily extensible Python library used to write network testing and validation tools, packet debugger, a tool based on PCS for interactively working with packet streams such as those collected with TCP dump. Conductor is a system for controlling distributed systems during tests. It is meant to replace testing by hand with multiple SSH sessions, or depending on a ton of random shell scripts to execute network-based tests with multiple clients. To know more both about FreeBSD, George, Neville, Neil, or the things he did and being involved in, you can check the links on the show note. I included many links I could find, including a link for the FreeBSD journal, which is kind of like a magazine which made by the FreeBSD Foundation. Also, you can check out another podcast, which is not mine, which is solely focused on BSD. It's called BSD Now. Their link is in the show notes. They are bsdnow.tv. They have a lot of episodes already on BSD and on many very technical topics. So if you're really interested, you can check those ones out. And as I mentioned, you can have a look at the link for George's website and see all the things he does or he did in the past, and you can even have his services as a consulting, as he runs a consulting company himself. For the future episodes, I have another person lined up for this kind of interview, similar like the one I just did with George. Let's see if that actually happens. If it does, then it will be a nice completion of this BSD topic. But no matter what, I really want to do at least one or two separate episodes. One on the history of BSD, and at least another one on FreeBSD itself. So that's actually would be two additional episodes apart from a possible interview which is in the pipelines, and nothing else will change apart from that. Once in a while, when I can try to do this kind of special episodes, but normal episodes will be always as before. The only difference that we switch to the 3 p.m. UTC slot, so we are not on the 6 p.m. UTC slot as before, but the phone line is still active, even though no one calls, and the contact details as always are in the show notes. No one really makes any contact so far, but we will see. So that's about this episode and plans for the future episodes. So let's see how it works out. Thank you very much for listening, and see you next Saturday.